Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our, I think our fourth talk of the day. So we'll just give everybody a couple of minutes to get involved. So before we get started, I just wanted to give another shout out to our sponsor, AdRoll. It's only with their help that we've been able to pull this first Humans Come Summit together. I'd invite you to all go and check out their Growth Gorilla community that they've set up. It's designed to support marketers, and go check it out on adroll.com/community. It's definitely worth kind of a flick through. Don't forget to use the hashtag HCF Summit. We're trying to make sure that we stay up to date with everything. And as we've said, like all throughout the day, we're trying to make sure that obviously there are going to be a few hashtags out there at the moment that are probably going to drown it out somewhat, but that's fine. I'm not trying to get it to top out on Twitter. But make sure you're joining the Facebook group too, because what we're trying to do is make sure that we have that conversation, make sure we build that community, and kind of like pull the content together, bring everybody together. And that's what we'd like out of this. We don't just want it to be us preaching content to you. We want to actually have a bit of engagement off of it. So jump into the Facebook group. You should all have that in your emails by now. As with all the talks, make sure you're using the Q&A functionality. So the Q&A functionality should be in the middle bottom of your screen in the Zoom window. Like if you've got a question, throw it in there, because then we can make sure that we definitely get to them, or we can prioritize them. People can upvote them, all that kind of stuff. So with all the admin stuff out of the way, that's always like the sexiest part of the talk. This next talk is a bit of a change of pace from the marketing talks that we've had throughout the day. So we're starting to bring in elements of sales too now. In this talk, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Doug Landis. Doug is growth partner at Emergence Capital, working with a portfolio of clients that reads like a who's who of the tech and SaaS space, including EchoSign, Salesforce, and Zoom. His role is to create platforms and go-to-market strategies that help companies scale, grow, and ultimately become the next billion-dollar SaaS company. What Doug doesn't know about sales, and so I've only had a few conversations with Doug, and I've kind of obviously kind of vetted and had a look at his background and stuff, but it's evident that what Doug doesn't know about sales and marketing driven growth isn't worth knowing, and we're incredibly lucky to have him along to talk to us today. So Doug, welcome to the Humans Come First Summit. How was the introduction? Did I balls any of that up, or is it roughly right?
That was pretty good. I mean, I like what I don't know about sales and marketing. That's a big statement, because look, I believe that all of us should always be learning. So even myself, that's been doing this for 30 years. There's still lots to learn.
I am a marketer after all, so I did have to use big words and kind of make it look pretty. So,
oh man, I'm so glad you said that, because that's fundamentally one of the biggest kind of points of contention between sales and marketing leaders in particular. It's like, all right, I hear a lot of talk, but I don't know if I see all the action behind it. I'm not going to get into some of the challenges between sales and marketing, but what I will tell you is what we're going to talk about. This notion of storytelling is actually really relevant, not just for sellers. It's super relevant for marketers, because largely, if we rely on marketers to help build the narrative outside in the broader ecosystem, before a salesperson actually gets on the phone, we actually really need that voice. And one of the things I'm going to recommend is you start to turn that voice around and use more of the voice of your customers to tell your story versus you telling it, because most buyers don't actually really trust sellers or marketers, really, for that matter. No offense. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. One thing I will also note, don't hold this against me, but I'm also a Chelsea supporter. But I have been since Gianfranco Zola. He's one of my favorite players of all time. So for all of you,
I think you just lost half of the audience.
Yeah, that's all good. It's okay. Like I said, don't hold it against me. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is I'm a real football fan versus, the American football, which I appreciate. I just happen to like soccer a bit better. And interestingly enough too, I think the other thing is, and Richard, I appreciate you having me on here. I am a salesperson masked as a marketer, or a marketer masked as a salesperson. Either way, I've worn both hats, and I understand both roles and the importance of both roles in an organization. And as we get into talking about storytelling, yes, definitely ask questions, make comments in the chat. I'll be watching it and paying attention. But Dave, don't switch off just because I said Chelsea. But we're going to talk about just the like probably one of the most human skills of all time, which is storytelling. It's something that we do as human beings day in and day out. And the reality is we don't, I think the truth is, and what I've seen is we don't actually focus on it enough as a skill. It's something we do, but we don't focus on it enough. Therefore, when we get to work, we actually lose that part of ourselves, or we shut that off. And I'm going to recommend we turn that back on. And in particular for you marketers, you turn that on by 1,000, because we need to be doing more of this, because this is the way in which we connect and engage with human beings. It's just what we do. In fact, if you think about it, 400,000 years ago, men and women used to sit around a fire pit and tell stories about their day, or their hunt, if you will. It's so prevalent that the gentleman that owns this island here, Sir Richard Branson, actually commissioned an artist to build a giant fire pit where he and his team, pre-COVID, would meet weekly to sit around and talk about their day and what's going on. So the truth is storytelling is this, it's an innate human element. It's a human skill. It's how we normally communicate to one another. Yet when it comes to work and business, and unfortunately marketers, I'm going to pick on you just a little bit, but when it comes to our sales presentations, all of a sudden we see slides like this. And it's like, what the hell am I looking at? What is this mess? Oh, I'm trying to make a point. We solve the challenges of legacy technology. But the reality is this is really difficult for buyers or prospects to unpack and identify with and connect with. So my question for all of you is, why the hell don't we tell more stories at work? What's that switch that needs to happen in order for us to, 1, tell more stories, 2, get better at it, and 3, make this part of our core DNA at work? And that's fundamentally what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about 4 things: why stories matter, the power of stories. I'm going to give you a couple of frameworks because I believe in those, but not 2x2s because I'm not a consultant. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about a framework of how to tell your story at your organization, whether you're one person or whether you're Zoom. And by the way, I've done this for organizations of all shapes and sizes. It's actually usually a 2-hour workshop where we break into some of the core tools that you actually need to sharpen in order to get better, the tools in your tool shed. But for a little bit of context about why me and why this subject is really relevant to me, my last role before joining the dark side. So I'm a partner at Emergence Capital. We're an early stage B2B SaaS venture capital firm. As Richard mentioned, we've been very fortunate. We made a bet 16 years ago now that all software was going to move to the cloud. Salesforce was our first investment. Not a bad pick. And then we invested in SteelBrick and Yammer and SuccessFactors and Viva and Zoom. So we've done fairly well, and Box in particular. So what happened was about 6 years ago, I was working at Box. I was the VP of sales productivity, so running productivity and strategy. And one of the things, we hired a new CRO, this gentleman by the name of Graham Younger, an Irishman with a very charismatic disposition about him. And it was interesting because anytime you hire a new sales leader, even marketing leader, what's one of the first things you do? You go talk to the sales reps and you're like, cool, tell me how you tell the Box story. And so I went with him on this little journey, and he talked about 20 different reps, and he got 20 different versions of the story. And he immediately looked at me and he's like, okay, so we have a bit of a problem. We have a consistency issue, meaning like nobody really knows what the hell to say about who we are and the value that we deliver. Everyone is trying to be like our CEO, Aaron Levy. If you've ever watched him on Twitter, he's very dynamic. And he's probably he speaks at the 40,000 foot view, and as sales reps, we speak at like the 500 foot view. So there's a big gap there if you're trying to be like your CEO. And the other thing was, it was incredibly selfish and self-serving, meaning everything about what everyone was saying was all about us from our point of view. And the truth is, if you have sales in your title, no one trusts you. I'm sorry. And marketing, the trust level is maybe a little bit higher, but at the end of the day, people want to understand who you are and your value through what you deliver and who you support, and basically through their voice. So fast forward, we flipped all of our messaging around. I created a role for myself called the Chief Storyteller. And the whole goal was we wanted to infuse more of our stories about our customers into our vision about who we are and how we talk about ourselves. So that's a little context, and that's where this comes from. And it dawned on me, and in fact, because we invest in Series A and B stage companies, I do this with all of our early stage companies. I help them unpack who they are using the voice of their customer and infusing more stories in their conversation. And this is what you guys are going to learn right now. Here's the deal. As human beings, our goal, our desire when we're listening to someone tell a story is we look for the patterns and then we try and fill in the gaps. That's just what we do as human beings. It's why in commercials they use jingles, because we remember that pattern, right? We're all in the pattern recognition business as human beings. And so that's what's happening when someone's telling a story. Just remember that, because the reality is when it comes to telling a story, you don't have to tell all of the details. You can leave gaps in there and let us as human beings fill in those gaps to create their own version of the narrative. It's really, really powerful. So you don't have to think that a story has to be this long diatribe. Truth is, stories matter for a number of reasons. Number one, the truth, when someone's telling a great story, people tend to lean in and they tend to listen more acutely. They're much more focused. Stories are an incredible way to teach and inspire. Also, stories are the easiest way of making complex ideas simple. So if what you're selling or what you're marketing is complex, I want you to do two things. Quit using your own language, get out of your own way and start using simple language, and start using more stories, because they help us to make sense of things, especially things that are really complex and technical. And at the end of the day, stories build connection. If you guys want to build a community, I mean, this humans come first community. Richard, if I were you, I'd just drop a story in there and be like, here's what I mean about, here's what I mean about an example of humans come first. Simplify things. That's how we communicate as a whole. Stories also matter because at the end of the day, what Maya Angelou said is people may forget what you said or did, but they're never going to forget how they made you feel, right? It's the feeling, it's the visceral part. And guess what? In stories, we have emotion. See, the thing about stories that's really powerful is two things physiologically happen. First, when someone's telling you a story, it triggers cortisol in your body, and that forces you to focus. It's like, right, when you're hearing a great story, all of a sudden you're like, ooh, I want more, I want more, I want more. The other thing that stories do is they release oxytocin, and oxytocin evokes emotion. Oxytocin gets us all that warm, fuzzy feeling. So when you're hearing a great story, whether it has a positive or negative outcome, whatever the case may be, you feel it viscerally. It's why, they call it pulling on the heartstrings. It's because physiologically change is happening in you. It's amazing. All just because we're telling a story. But if you tell the story the wrong way, then you may not actually trigger that physiological sensation. I'm going to tell you what the difference is between the wrong way and the right way here in just a second. But at the end of the day, the stories evoke emotion. By the way, emotion evokes action. When you get fired up hearing a story, you're like, I want to vote. I want to take action. I want to go do this. And that's what happens when you hear a great story. Hence the reason why most of our leaders, political leaders, are great storytellers. I say most, not all. I'm not going to get political. I'm just saying that. So here's your first homework assignment, if you will. I want you to wrap all of your ideas in a narrative. So if you're a marketer and you're like, hey, I think we need to start moving up into the selling into the enterprise or selling to bigger customers. That's your idea. You want to get people inspired behind this idea. Well, yes, you're going to need all the data to support that. I'm not going to refute that, but just wrap that whole idea in a narrative and tell a great story about why you think this really matters. And then use the facts and stats to support that story. That's the way to use stories. Unfortunately, we have a tendency in the business world is using facts and stats first, and then somewhere along the line, we'll drop a story in there. And guess what? We forget all the facts and stats, but we remember that story. The good news here is great storytellers are made. They're not born this way. I mean, yes, some of us are born maybe a little bit more outgoing, maybe a higher level of intellect, but the reality is great storytellers are made because they start by listening. Great storytellers become great because they listen first, and they listen with their whole body, not just their ears. And they're looking for the moments to build that connection. They're looking for the moments to actually identify a great story opportunity. I'm going to tell you how to do this in just a second. Truth be told, we process information through story. It's just how we do as human beings. As I said before, we look for the patterns and then we fill in the gaps. So don't forget that. Lead with stories first and then facts and stats. So challenge number 2, I know it's listed as challenge number 1. Challenge number 1 is wrap your ideas in a narrative. Challenge number 2 is start bringing your weekend self to work. It's crazy. Whenever you leave work, and these days it's like you turn off your screen and you go out of your office and you go into your living room. But when we leave work, typically we talk to our friends and our family and our loved ones. And what do? We say things like, well, how was your day? Oh, let me tell you, I went to this workshop. I was at this Human Comes First thing, and I listened to this whole storytelling workshop, and you just tell a story about it. But then all of a sudden you get to work. What do? You speak in bullets, fragments, you write in texts. Like, it's bananas how we communicate when all of a sudden, all we have to do is just share a story, and a story doesn't have to be long, and people will get it faster. Much better, by the way, on the sales side, because in every deal over $10,000, there are at least 8 to 10 people involved in the buying decision. And if you're only talking to 1 or 2 people, guess what? Their job is to turn around and sell on your behalf to the other 6 or 7 or 8 people. How do they do that? The slides with a bunch of bullets, and they got to make stuff up because they don't really remember, through their chicken scratch notes. No, if you tell them a story, it makes it so much easier to consume and to feel and then to share. So bring your weekend self to work. The other thing is your presentations. For those of you that are in marketing, that are building presentations for your sales team, I want you to include opportunities for sellers to actually share stories. Your challenge, though, is to help them understand which stories they may want to share for which audience. So if I've got a 10-slide deck, 6 of those slides should create an opportunity for me to tell a story. 6 out of 10. Now, the very first slide, your opening slide, should be the first one. Meaning you need to say something provocative on that slide that will create an opportunity for me to share a story if I'm the seller. So just remember this. Use more stories in your presentations. Now, here's why most people don't tell stories at work. Because everyone's afraid of being that person that's stuck in the corner at a party with the other person who won't stop talking, right? Because the reality is when you find yourself in that situation where you're with somebody and they just ramble on, the truth is they don't have a point. Every story must have a point. And so an exercise for you, look at your customer success stories. Listen to the stories that your reps tell. Listen to the stories that you tell, that your CEO tells. And if you can't in one sentence articulate the point of that story, then there's no point of that story. And then you've got a problem. So 2 exercises for you. The first one is always ask yourself, why am I telling this story right now? And why am I telling it to you, in particular, this audience? And secondarily, I want you to be able to answer the question, what is the point of this story in one sentence? And it's a great exercise to do in team meetings. Like for a sales team, have a rep tell a story, a success story. Maybe it was about a call they had with a customer or a deal that they won or an experience that they had, maybe with someone even internally, have them share a story, have everybody else in the room call a timeout, have everybody else in the room and tell them what they thought the point of that story was. It's incredibly powerful. If you're not clear about the point of the story, your audience is going to be completely lost and confused. We don't want that. And of course, every story you tell has to be relevant to your audience. So here's my suggestion, marketers. I'm going to pick on you. I want you to build a story library for the rest of the people in your company. A library in particular by buyer persona that you target, and for sales by stage. You should have a story to tell to your primary buyer in the very first call, also in the second call, in the demo, in the negotiation, and also with procurement. Build out this story library. It can make it easier for us as reps to understand which stories I could or should use at certain times for certain audiences. Try and make it easy for me. And by the way, the reality is if you're using a platform like Chorus, which we recommend because we're investors, then you can capture little snippets in the recordings and drop them into this matrix. But there are other things that I want you to include in the matrix. Don't just include a link to the story. Also write out what's the point of the story. So I don't have to actually try and craft it myself. I want it shared. All right, so let's talk about the power of stories and why I think they're so incredibly powerful. Ravi, by the way, your question as how do you get an organization to buy in and believe in the brand story? Well, first of all, if it starts at the CEO level, then everyone should buy into that, because if you don't believe the CEO or the co-founder of the company, then what the hell are you doing there? First and foremost. I think the problem is the believability, believability becomes exponentially more impactful when you use the voice of a customer to tell that brand story versus you as a marketer or the CMO. Your customer's voice is 10,000 times more powerful and believable than if it's your voice. So that's just a tip for you. Ravi, I'll get to some of your other questions here in just a second. Your market, how does that differ for establishment? Okay, cool. I can answer some of these questions here in just a minute. I want to talk a little bit more about why stories are powerful and give you some frameworks. And then we can talk about creating a narrative for different markets and different audiences. But at the end of the day, I'm always going to lean on Go get your customers to craft that narrative for you or with you, especially for different markets. Really, really important. Use the voice of your customer instead of just you trying to craft the story on its own, because people are less likely to believe you. But tell you what, storytellers, they do tend to believe. See, the thing about storytellers is, and the power of stories is, stories are interesting and they tend to connect with us much more so than facts and stats, right? And so surprise or emotion in that story actually gets us connected and engaged. And as a listener, as I said, because of the cortisol, I'm much more focused on you. Hence the reason why stories work so much. If you've ever heard of Nordstrom's, then maybe you're aware about, this is a store in the US. I apologize, that was terrible on my behalf, but maybe you're aware of the fact that they've got an incredible customer service and support belief, shall we say, or that's what people think of when you think of the brand. The reality, this all happened because a gentleman walked into a store in Anchorage, Alaska in the 70s, was converted from a tire store to Nordstrom's. And a gentleman and a young sales associate was actually, just after training, was taught that a customer is always right. And in 1970, a gentleman walked in with 4 used tires and asked the young associate to return the tires, if we would take them back. The associate said, okay. And they came up with a price and he gave him his money back. And that's what triggered the story about Nordstrom's and their incredible customer service, that you could literally buy a pair of shoes, wear them out on New Year's Eve, bring them back, and they'll give you the money back. Now, they don't do that so much anymore, but that was actually how they got started. Reality is that story actually made their brand. This is an example of what's called a signature story. And so Ravi, this is what we're looking for. What is that aha moment, a story from a customer that connects to your brand and all of a sudden turns your brand into something other than just a logo? The other thing about stories is they're really easy to unpack, because there's a story arc, right? There's a beginning, middle, and end. And in many cases, a great story, when you're hearing a great story as a listener, I'm trying to find myself in the story, or all of a sudden it may trigger a connection to a previous experience that I had or somebody else had. That's the thing about stories. All of a sudden it's like, we're either trying to put ourselves in the story or somebody else in the story, because all of a sudden we relate to it. And then all of a sudden it opens up in a whole new can of worms based on maybe a previous experience that I had, which is really amazing. Here's the truth though. Just know this: facts fade, stories stick. No matter who wins this election here in the United States, the shit show that we're in the midst of right now, I'm willing to bet that we're not going to remember all the things and the lies and the finger pointing that each one of them, and they're both guilty of it, maybe one more so than the other, but we're not going to remember all of those things that they said. What we're going to remember is where we were, the moment in time that the election was complete. That's what we're going to remember. I can tell you 4 years ago, I was in Boston, when Hillary was up against Trump. I was in Boston. I was speaking at a conference called Inbound, and my session was the day after the election at 9 a.m. It was the last day of the conference, and I figured there's no one going to be there. And I remember it was 2 o'clock in the morning. I was sitting on the edge of my bed with a glass of whiskey in my hand when it was announced that Trump won. And I thought to myself, oh shit, I now need to move to Australia. But then the other thing I thought is like, wow, no one's actually going to show up. Turns out the room was packed and we had a blast. But I remember that story and that experience. I don't remember everything else that happened. No way, you're an Inbound for that? That's hilarious. Okay, Ravi, I love Canada too. But I'm a surfer, so there's better surfing in Australia. Anyway, here's the interesting thing. Jeff Bezos believes in the power of stories so much so that he actually eliminated PowerPoint, because most people build PowerPoint slides with bullets and all this information, like that second slide that I shared with you. And instead, what they do is they write a memo and then they have a conversation about that, because they believe it actually draws more of a dialogue. The last thing about storytelling or stories is they're super persuasive. And the truth is that storyteller is usually more liked. If I just spew out a bunch of facts at you, by default, as human beings, we want to refute those. We want to dissect those. I want proof. Who said that? How prove that? Especially now with social media, and then there's fake news, etc. Like, we don't trust facts, but we trust stories, because the storyteller tends to be more liked, and we're less likely to challenge the person. Although we may question how much it's been embellished, but we're not going to challenge them based on the actual story itself. Really interesting. The other thing about stories, as I said before, because we detect patterns, is we don't actually have to tell everybody everything, because as human beings, we can deduce the logic on our own. What I mean by that is you don't always have to say the answer. So if I tell you 2 + 2, I can just move right on, because you all know what 2 + 2 is, right? So the truth is we don't have to tell our audience everything. And the gentleman by the name of Ernest Hemingway proved this point. He was sitting at a bar back in 1910. I'm not sure, really sure what that was like, but a gentleman walked in, put a $10 bill on the bar, and he said, "I bet you can't write a novel in 6 words or less." And he did. Baby shoes, for sale, never worn. Is that a story? Hell yeah, it is. Unfortunately, it always takes us to a really dark place. Everyone automatically immediately assumes that something happened to the baby, and it's like, oh shit. I tend to be more positive, and I think, hey, these guys were loaded. Babies grow really fast. He had so many shoes, never had a chance to wear them. I'm giving him the pronoun of he because I want a son, but that's a totally different story. Reality is there's a character, or there's a bunch of characters in there, and there's actually some emotion in here. Interesting. So the emotion is never worn. We're going to talk a little bit more about the elements that make up a great story here in just a second. But the reality is I wanted to give you an example of the fact that you can tell a story in 6 words or less. I loved her. She loved him. We fill in all the details. What happened? Why did that happen? Did they get a divorce? Blah, 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 right? Getting old. Ringtones piss me off. Why did that happen, right? So I can fill in and deduce all of the logic itself. And oh, by the way, I can identify a character, characters, and emotion in each and every one of these. So that's the thing about stories. They don't have to be these long diatribes, so long as you're clear about what the point is, and so long as you have the key elements, which I'll get into it here in just a second. I will say, Ben Horowitz, at the end of the day, everybody agrees stories are much more powerful than what we tend to stick to, which is facts, stats, bullets, fragmented statements. If you don't have a great story, it's actually hard to get your company in motion. That's part of that signature story that we're talking about, i.e. the Nordstrom story. Mark Benioff, his story. Salesforce. Why can't enterprise software be as easy as buying a book on Amazon? Period. That was his driver. It's like, oh gosh, that makes so much sense. We've got Amazon, we can buy books. Why can't we have a similar experience in the world of enterprise software? Hence, Salesforce was born. I keep talking about this notion of signature stories. Thank you to Jennifer Aker, the professor at Stanford, and this concept. But a signature story is actually a real asset. That Nordstrom story is a real asset. And there's so many companies out there that have these incredible stories. Bonobos is another great example, and how they rebranded some of their jeans based on the stories that their customers were telling them about how they were wearing them and what they were doing with them. And all of a sudden they're like, that's brilliant. We're going to brand them these jeans called the travel jeans instead of just jeans, right? So compelling story is a signature story, and it's because it answers the why. Marketers, quit talking about the what and how. Sellers, quit talking about the what and how. You do that all day, every day. Talk about the why. Why to everything. Use why as your trigger to help craft more of your stories. In particular, I want you to be able to answer the question, and you must have a really good story about this, but why does your company exist? Or why do you work for your company? If you don't have a great story for either one of those, then you're way behind the 8 ball. And in fact, as leaders, you should ask everyone on your team to answer these 2 questions and to build stories around that, because it's a great way of actually articulating who you are and what you do through your own voice and through your own story. It's really, really powerful, very powerful tool. But at the end of the day, it's just answering the why question, not the what and the how, which we do all too frequently, and we don't get into the visceral elements of like why did you organize your application that way? Why are your buttons there? Why do you beat your competitors? Why do you think you're going to be the next multi-billion-dollar iconic software company? Why? Keep digging into the why, and you'll start crafting incredible stories that you didn't even know you had access to. The point of this is what I'm trying to tell you is you need to be telling more stories across your entire organization, more than just these signature stories, more than just customer success stories, which we all know. By the way, I'm just going to say this right now. Quit with the same old school, just boring ass approach of like problem, solution, ROI, customer logo. Yay. It's horse shit. Excuse my French. Sorry, Richard. But it's just so boring. I want a story. And guess what? A story doesn't have a logo. A story has a person. What changed in their life in that story? The reason why sales reps suck at telling customer success stories is because they don't understand like, oh, here's the problem and here's the solution, here's the ROI. No, like you're making it difficult for them. Write it as a story. Write it as a news brief, right? Don't write it as problem, solution, ROI. Just saying. All right, so there's a bunch of different stories that we should be able to tell. By the way, everyone should have their own personal aha moment story when they used your product and realized, holy cow, this is so powerful and incredibly valuable. right? You need user stories, you need product stories, you need the why stories, and of course you need competitive stories. We need it. There's a lot of different stories. The point is there's a ton of different stories that we could and should be using across the organization. And yet, what do? We tell maybe the origin story, and we tell maybe the founding story. Maybe we tell some customer stories. Y'all need to ratchet up the amount of stories that you're telling across the organization by a factor of 100, because this is the way in which we communicate. We don't use our own tech speak, where people get very lost and confused. All right, now I want to introduce you a framework that you can use to become a better storyteller. And then we're going to get into some of the tools. I'm going to end with a framework that you can use to tell your story. And then, yeah, I think that's about it. So, all right, when it comes to becoming a better storyteller, I want you to think of the acronym TRANCE, because when you're listening to a story, a really great story kind of feels like you're in a trance, right? You're watching a great movie. You're like, I can't stop. But it is an acronym. Stands for something. The T means take your listener on a journey. Contrast is one of the most powerful and important tools in storytelling. From what was to what is, from what is to what could be. One of the most powerful words in the world of storytelling that you hear all of the time, but I bet you many of you forget about, that is used in the world of television and movies day in and day out, even commercials, is they use the word imagine. Imagine a world. Like I'm like, what is this voice that's coming out of me? But the reality is, it's like, imagine you were here and now you're here. Imagine you're here and now you could be there. Really, really powerful. It's that contrast that actually creates the journey, which starts to create the emotion because you're taking me on a ride. Amazing. The R stands for, remember the rule of three. You got to have a beginning, middle, and end, i.e. if you've got a journey, guess what? You've got a starting point and you've got an end point. So now I can start to build that story arc. Beginning, middle, and end. End is outcome, what happened, right? Analogies and metaphors are an incredibly powerful vehicle. Just like contrast, analogies and metaphors can help make very complex ideas feel simple. I've got a little homework assignment for you that's a fun exercise I want you to do in your own organization. Outside of answering the questions why your company exists and why do you work there, I want you to answer some fun questions about some analogies about your company. We'll talk about that in just a second. Of course, and organize your narrative, make sure it's relevant to your audience and that you're clear about the point of the story and that everyone is on par with what the point of your story is. Of course, identify the characters. Who are the characters in your story? Make sure you label them and identify them easily. And then of course, where's the emotion? If there's not a whole lot of emotion in your story, it's hard to really kind of get behind. Cool. All right, I want to dig into this. All stories follow a sequence. I told you about this, right? In order to create, I gotta put my sleeves up. I'm getting it hot in here. In order to create a great story, you gotta have a setting, a time and a place, right? That is, if you remember my story about Why Me, I told you what, 6 years ago, we hired a CRO by the name of Graham Younger. 6 years ago, I put a stake in the ground, setting, time and a place, and I gave you a person, CRO Graham Younger. So there was a setting, a time and a place, and then there was a surprise event. We went and interviewed all these reps, and guess what? They sucked. Ish. Wow. We realized we got to turn things around. So there was a turning point. I rewrote everything, started infusing the voice of our customer, and next thing you know, we actually tell our story a different way. All stories follow this same sequence. Setting, time, and a place, surprise event, turning point, resolution. Straightforward. So if you're clear about the point you're trying to tell, you follow this structure, and you also are clear about what the resolution was, like how did they get there? That's part of the journey. And you're really, really clear about the fact that there's a character or characters there, then you've got yourself a story. Just be very clear. A sequence of events doesn't make a story automatically. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Why? Because what's largely missing in that, well, first of all, there's not a whole lot of contrast. It's just literally a list of events. Second of all, we're missing that surprise event and we're missing the turning point. But more importantly, we're also missing a character or characters. And here's a note. I'm so sick of this. Companies are not characters. I don't give a shit about all your logos. They mean nothing to me. If I tell you like, oh, we work with Cisco, oh, good for you. Is that Cisco Foods or Cisco, the ginormous technology company in San Jose? I don't know. And if I even say it's the ginormous technology company in San Jose, what are you connected to? Nothing. It's just a big freaking company. Use people and their titles. So on your customer stories page or our success stories or our customers, whatever it is, quit putting all these damn logos up. Start putting people and their title, because that's what I'm looking for. How did you change Richard's life? How did you change Susan's life? How did you change Joe's life? Not what, oh, how are you working with Cisco? Or how are you, how many times people have these ginormous logos up and they've got like a $5,000 deal with them. They're like, woo, we work with Cisco. Ah, even though it's, it makes it feel like it's much bigger. So I'm just telling you. Yeah, cool. Thank you, Richard, for answering that. We will share these. But please quit using companies as characters. Inanimate objects, by the way, are also not characters. People are characters. All right. Now I'm going to show you a framework on how to tell your story. Very simple and straightforward. Oh, before I do that, though, here's a fun little homework assignment. Homework assignment is this. So I told you analogies and metaphors are really powerful. I want you to do an exercise in your organization, maybe do it with your team first, and take your company. So I'm gonna use Emergence Capital as my example. And I want you to craft as many analogies as you possibly can for your company. And so you do it like this, finish the sentence. Emergence Capital is like, ... And then finish that sentence. But you need to include the why is it like that? Emergence Capital, and I'm totally doing this on the fly, so I could totally botch this, but by the way, there's no wrong or bad answers. It just takes a little bit of polishing, right? So Emergence Capital is like, no, I don't want to get political here for a second. Emergence Capital is like, it's like your best friend. They're always going to be there to support you no matter what's going on in your life, and the support is unconditional. I just pulled that out of my big toes. I don't really know if that resonates, but the reality is I want you to do this exercise. You'd be amazed with what you come up with. Amazed. I just did this yesterday and we had a really fun experience going through this exercise. So just do it. You'd be surprised with what you come up with. The reality is what you're trying to do is you're trying to use simple language to articulate who you are and what you do to people that don't understand it. Oh yeah, we're a platform that allows you to connect and engage with all of your contacts so you can manage them. Blah, blah, blah. Throw up. Come on. Like, we live in a world where we speak like, human beings, not that we speak tech speak. So just be really, really careful about it. All right. So now I'm going to talk to you about how to tell your story. By the way, analogies and metaphors are a really, really powerful tool to help you tell your story. And I'll show you kind of how to put it all together here in just a second. So here's my big issue though with first call decks, and all of you marketers that build these, shame on you because they're remarkably arrogant. I'm going to give you an example of Salesforce because I spent a lot of time there. What do you notice on this first slide? Oh, look at me. It's all about Salesforce. What I care about as the listener is how to build apps fast. So remember when I said use that first slide and use it to actually provoke your audience? Instead of having all this shit on here about Salesforce, why don't we take the Salesforce logo, gray it out, move it down in the corner, and just write, build apps in seconds, not days. And guess what? If I'm using this slide, this opening slide to present to a bunch of customers or prospects, I can then tell a story about my experience of building an app. First app that I ever tried to build took me 2 years. Now all of a sudden, because of the App Cloud, I built one in 2 days. Holy shit. My name's Doug Landis. I'm going to tell you a story about how to build apps in days, not months or weeks, not weeks or months or years. This is their next slide. Here's their platform. And this is an old deck, so I can pick on it. And then, of course, the last one is, hey, look at all of our customers, all this momentum. Yeah, screw you. You're so arrogant. Come on, Kanye. Quit it. What I'm saying is your logo slide needs to be who you've learned from, not look at how much momentum and how much success we've had. Yay, right? This is like, quit being so damn arrogant. I could put Kanye up here. I could also put Trump up here. Whether you're a Trump supporter or not, they're both pretty damn arrogant. The reality is the stories and storytelling is a critical element to how you think about your messaging and positioning. I want you to kind of start to flip things around, right? Because to nail your messaging and positioning, you need to make it about them, your customers and your prospects, and not about you. Quit talking about yourself so damn fast. Even if somebody asks, like, who are you? And tell me, what do you do? You're like, awesome. Let me walk you through our story, right? And our story begins by changing our narrative even around this deck that you build. I don't want you to call it a first call deck anymore. It's an initial conversation. That's all what we're doing is we're having conversations. And in every conversation, we're trying to determine if it makes sense for us to have another conversation. So quit calling it a deck, quit calling it a pitch deck, because anytime you bring those two things up, immediately I feel like you're going to talk at me. But instead, we're having a conversation. And I'm going to share some of the things that we've learned from customers that are just like you. How about that? Feels a lot easier, doesn't it? Especially as a listener, like, cool, I want to hear about people that are just like me. I don't necessarily want to hear all about you. Because if you're not the founder, CEO, if you're not Aaron Levy or Mark Benioff or Richard Wood over here, like, people don't trust you, right? And so you've got to build credibility. So how do you do that? I'm going to introduce you to a framework that you can all use, a la Challenger-esque, although I've tweaked it all around, but there are some similarities here that you might recognize. The first thing I want you to do is I want you to use that very first slide, especially since we're all in lockdown and COVID. We're not doing face-to-face presentations anymore. We're doing Zoom presentations. And so what happens is my little head is this little box up here in the corner, and all I look at is this first slide. That's incredible real estate. Use it. Say something provocative. And oh, by the way, put their logo on the damn front, not yours. Yours in the corner. There's the front. Do it. And say something to get them thinking, because at the end of the day, the brain drives your actions, right? So emotion evokes action. I want to trigger some emotion. So guess what? I'm going to say something interesting and provocative. Slide number 2. This is where you're building credibility. So that I never want to see it. If anybody ever puts up a logo slide and look at all of our customers, I literally took all the time out. And I'm like, I don't care. I don't care. Everybody has a logo slide. Who the hell cares? What I want you to do is I want you to change that logo slide. I want you to say, here's who we've learned from. And oh, by the way, this is what we've learned. Wow. That's what I care about. Who have you learned from? What did you learn? And then slide 3, this is where things start to get interesting, because I'm willing to bet the things that you've learned, kind of standard issue, are things that I'm already aware of as a buyer or prospect. So tell me about the things that you learned that I may not be aware of. I call these unidentified problems, because the reality is that's what I really care about. And let me give you an example of this. In the world of SaaS applications are remarkably easy to buy, right? I can give you a credit card, you turn it on for me, I log in, boom, I'm in. I can also turn it off. They're like, cancel, I'm no longer interested. The hardest thing about SaaS applications is change management. You're asking people to change behaviors, and that's really difficult. So how do you drive adoption? How do you drive usage? I'll give you a little tip here, because I created this. Adoption is the new ROI today. If you're speaking to a CFO, just be like, look, it's all about adoption. You never want to buy a solution that you're not going to get 100% adoption from. We can ensure that happens. And by the way, I've got 10,000 examples, and we're going to bring every one of them in here to tell you what it's like. That's a problem that most people aren't even thinking about. Like, oh shit, how am I going to change behavior with this new application? I know it's easy, but you're talking about somebody, even using Box. It's like, oh, I'm going from storing them on my hard drive to putting them in the cloud. That seems weird. Now people get it, but changing behavior is important. So make sure you identify the problems that your customers are likely not aware of. Then you can use some statistics to elevate these problems. Here's a really good one. And then use a real life story of a person in a role that was struggling, that you learn from. You're like, wow, they were really struggling. And here's what their struggle was like. And God, it sucked. By the way, I'm still building the problem. I'm still building the pain, because on slide 6, I'm introducing the possibility of actually getting Richard out of this pain state and getting Richard into the happy state, right? And then lastly, I'm going to introduce our view of the world and how we think we can help Richard get from the pain state to the happy state. One of the things you'll notice here is we didn't start talking about our company until slide 7. Now, by the way, this framework, you don't even need to use slides. I can tell this whole story on its own. And when I'm talking about some of these problems that I've learned that I wasn't even aware, that we weren't even aware our customers were even having, guess what I can do? I can use that as an opportunity to have some discovery. Like, I'm curious, how does that resonate with you? Do any of these, what am I missing? Do you have other problems that we haven't even talked about? Holy smokes. I get you to prioritize, stack rank them. I'm cool. We can help you with your top 2. That's interesting. Shall we continue our conversation? Great. Instead, what we tend to do is we're like, here's who we are. Yay. Here's what we do. Yay. But just like, here's what we do and here's how we do it. Come on, stop that. Build some credibility first. Build your chance to craft some stories. By the way, in these first 7 slides, remember I said earlier, 65% of your presentations should be stories. In these first 7 slides, that means I basically need to tell a story on 5 slides. Easy. I can do it on the first one. I can do it on the second one. These are all the people that we've learned from. Let me tell you an example of something I learned from one of them, because they're one of my customers. Here are the problems. Wow, I wasn't even aware we had these problems, but let me tell you about Sue, who told me about this problem. Cool, there's another story. The statistics, I can tell you a story about how I got them. And then lastly, I can tell you a story about the story. What do you know? A lot of different story opportunities here in just 7 slides. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's all easy. It starts to come together if you start thinking more about stories and the story framework. Some other things to consider is if you want to get better, here are some great books. I've hopefully got mine coming out here in a month by Christmas that will also be on here, but you've got a bunch of little amazing nuggets that are going to come out in that book. And that, my friends, is how to become a better storyteller.
Doug, I think I speak for the group when I say that was fucking awesome. It was, I've got like, I don't have a notebook anywhere near me, so I now have like 30 odd post-it notes kind of like spread across my desk with different takeaways from that. Even though I was telling James at the same time not to write it down because we've got the video, but like that was great. It was one of the questions I had. So on the conversation framework that you just pulled up, right? And so that like, just the title of that struck home with me because we do a lot of conversational marketing and we're looking around the frameworks that we drive those conversations around. Now I know like the context you're positioning that in there is like we're looking at like a sales deck, for example.
Yep.
Could you imagine that framework being useful across like other marketing mediums? Now I'm not talking about like sending out brochures or like emails and shit like that. Well, maybe email to some extent, but could you imagine that framework being a means to drive marketing activity like like chatbots, emails, like 100%. Other elements?
Yeah. So a couple ideas. Number one, be careful if you're going to use it in emails because it might end up being really long and no one likes to read long emails. But there's a couple of things that you can do, right? So you can start to break that apart, right? So the logo slide, like I said, like we've learned from companies just like you. If you've been around for more than a year, you could say like, when I was at Box, it was like, look, over the last 8 years, we've learned from companies from all different shapes and sizes from all over the world that are just like you. And here are some of the things that we learned. Do you want to have a conversation about it? Click here to engage, right? So even just that piece we can use. And then guess what? We can take the next one. Hey, you know what? Over the last 6 years, we learned some really interesting insights from our customers that we weren't even aware were real insights or real problem areas. Let's talk about some of this. So like highlight some of the problem areas that we didn't even know that most of our customers don't even know are real problem areas, right? So there's 2 different slides that I can break up and turn into marketing assets for the broader organization. I could do the same thing with statistics. I could do the same thing with a story. I could take each one of those slides and basically turn those into an individual campaign on its own.
So I was literally stood here going, okay, how can I bend and reframe my agency to look like a SaaS company so that we can work with Doug?
I'm flattered, but you already are. Where this is it. This is what it does.
So we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, but like absolutely, like everybody else, if you've got questions for Doug, like we still got 10 minutes, like fire them out because I'm sure like there's a lot that all of us can learn from this. But so Ravi's question is, what's the most compelling narrative you've heard in the last year, and what's the worst?
Man, that's a really hard one because. Well, it's largely based on the fact because I spend all my time with our early stage companies, right? And so I probably get a little biased because I believe that every one of our companies that we've invested in, it has the chance to become an incredibly iconic software company. And the way in which their narratives have changed from the first time in which we invested them to maybe now is, to me, incredibly exciting, right? So if I look at, we've got a company called Upkeep, it's in LA. They're in the cloud maintenance management space. Seems relatively boring and mundane, but the reality is they're in the business of taking work out of work orders, and they're in the business of making maintenance workers heroes to their organization. Like, that's an incredible narrative. If you take the person that is being impacted by your software and your technology and you make them a hero, how are you making them a hero in their organization? That right there is one of the most compelling and incredibly powerful narratives that you can ever craft. And in fact, it was so compelling that they took 3 of their maintenance workers, highlighted their story, put them up on billboards in Times Square. We're talking about maintenance workers that never get any love or attention, blue collar folks that are now up on Times Square because of their story. How powerful is that? That even gives me the chills.
James asked a nice question. I think it's very similar to what I've just asked you as well. But how can stories fit into demand generation? For example, when promoting an ebook for SaaS.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, first of all, James, remember the fact that first of all, I would say tell a story, right? So if you want somebody to download this ebook, why? Why do you want them to download it? Why should they care? What are they going to get out of it? But actually don't get into the what are they going to get out of it, because again, we tend to focus on the what and the how too much and not so much on the why. Also remember the fact that you can craft a story in 6 words or less. You don't have to write, a 4 or 5 sentence long story that most people are going to stop reading after the first sentence, right? So get crafty. Have a fun little exercise and be like, cool, so what's a 6-word story that we can tell about this ebook? Boom. Craft a 6-word story. Test it out. See if it works. See if it gets people thinking. Again, the idea is I want to get people hooked and engaged. I want to get them thinking about what it is that we're trying to articulate. By the way, do not forget, be very clear about the point of the story that you're trying to make. Very clear. So if you like, this whole exercise about storytelling is, one, you got to have a point, you got to follow the structure, you got to be really clear about your characters, right? You need contrast. You should use some analogies and metaphors, right? Those things, that's just that in the simplest way.
And next one we've got is from Amon. So have you got some examples of stories that provoked you to think hard or get triggered?
Well, I mean,
triggered is an interesting word to use in this time.
I know that, like right now, are you kidding me? And by the way, that's also a really personal question, because you're asking about the things that trigger me. Things that trigger me are things like the things that happen where I don't know the answers to, right? So I'll just give you an example. I'm looking at my LA water and power bill right now, and it is ridiculously expensive. And I realize I don't understand why, and the power company won't tell me why, because they're just like, well, we just read your meter. And the truth is I don't understand enough about it to really know whether or not this is really fair or legitimate. That's just my example of being triggered, because when I feel like I don't have control, I don't have the answers, then I get really upset. Thinking hard and getting triggered, I think at the end of the day, it's all about knowing your audience. And you need to understand your audience and what actually matters to them, what's going to get them to think, what's going to get them triggered. Like, you got to know your audience inside and out. One of the first things that we do when we invest in a company, and we're talking Series A, so they've maybe $1 million in ARR, is like, first of all, who's your ICP? Who do you sell to and why? And why do they buy? What's their propensity to buy? And then who are the buyers? And I want to know everything about them. Where do they come from? How do they get paid? How do they get promoted? Those are the people, if you're the people that you're targeting, if you don't know that level of detail about them, then it's hard to build messaging that's actually going to get them to respond.
Last question. So generally speaking, what's been your highlight over the last year and what's the low light?
There's a lot of low lights, unfortunately, in 2020. The low lights are you kidding me? The low lights is the fact that we're locked down, this global pandemic, and people are dying every day. We had 100,000 new cases just yesterday in the United States. It's fucking ridiculous. That to me is a low light. The idiots out there that won't wear a mask, the idiots out there that think that this thing is just like the flu. You know what? Screw you. It's not. I know people who have died from it, and that you want to talk about something that triggers me? Oh yeah, don't even get me started. Highlight though is my wife and I sold our house in San Francisco and in Santa Cruz, packed up everything and moved down to LA and bought a house down here, and we fucking love it.
Congrats. I lied. One more question, because it's a good one. In storytelling, what do you find the most powerful motivator to an audience?
Yes.
Pain, gain, fear, relatable characters?
Whoever asks that question, that is the great question to ask. Here's the thing, as human beings, we tend to take more action based on loss or pain than we do on gain. So, you paint this picture of what the world could be like. Most people don't believe you because you're the one painting this picture. Unless you have customers that are actually fully experiencing that and will say that, it's really hard to paint that picture of the gain. You paint the picture of a pain or loss, and you got real tactical, solid advice about that, people will take action. People will like, oh, I don't want that. It's like, I know now not to put my hand on a hot stove because I know I'm going to burn it. Ow, I won't ever do that again. But if you like, hey, with this new pan, you can actually fry an egg in 5 seconds. Like, fuck, I don't believe that. What are you talking about?
Doug, this has been fucking brilliant. It's a great way to wrap the first day of presentations. We have, so for everybody else, we actually have Doug back in a couple of hours time. He's joining a sales panel along with our own Charlotte from Six and Flow. We also have Aidan joining us from HubSpot. It's going to be a great session because we're going to actually dig into kind of more of like the state of sales in 2020. And I think there's going to be some interesting angles from all of that. So,
oh yeah, I'm stoked.
If you've not had your fill of Doug yet, I'd absolutely recommend you come back at 8 o'clock GMT time, I believe. That's GMT, not GNT. Although we have just entered lockdown, so I imagine there's going to be a few glasses of wine.
Oh yeah, you guys are now being locked down again, right?
We have.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I can't tell you. I have a bunch of friends that are also in London, and I see the amount of parties that they've been going to over the last 6 months. I'm like, how is that possible? Yeah. Thank God none of you have gotten sick, but I'm like, we literally leave the house to go surf and golf, and that's it. That's it for 7 months, 8 months now. Enjoy your GNTs. I'll see everybody in a couple hours. Richard,
Doug, that was amazing. Thank you very much.
Super fun. You're welcome.
See you later, everybody.